Right now, as you are listening to this, you're probably alone.
Yeah, statistically speaking, most likely alone.
Right. Like maybe you're driving your car down some dark, empty highway, just, watching the headlights cut through the night. Or maybe you're just standing at the sink doing the dishes in your kitchen.
Or just sitting in a quiet room with your headphones on.
Exactly. Just letting a completely disembodied voice fill the physical space inside your head.
And when you really stop and isolate the mechanics of what is happening there,
Mhm.
it's a remarkably intimate act. I mean, you are basically surrendering your inner auditory landscape. You're letting someone else's thoughts and their vocal rhythms just totally occupy your mental real estate.
Yeah, and we treat it like it's just background noise, right? We treat it as this very modern, disposable form of entertainment, like it's just another piece of digital content floating in this ocean of endless media feeds.
Really?
But when we were digging through the anthropological and historical research for this deep dive, we realized that what you are doing right now as a listener isn't just entertainment.
Not at all.
By simply listening to a voice tell a story, you are actively engaging with the absolute oldest, most powerful social technology in the history of our species.
Yeah, and our modern perspective creates this massive conceptual blind spot for us. I mean, we hold our glowing smartphones, we tap our, wireless noise-canceling earbuds, and we just marvel at the hardware.
We think the technology is the silicon.
Exactly. We think the silicon and the battery are the tech. But the real technology, the invisible machinery that's actually doing the heavy lifting of holding human society together, that is the narrative itself.
Welcome, everyone, to today's deep dive. I am your host, and as always, I'm speaking directly to you, the listener, who is really our co-explorer on this journey. Today, we are exploring the incredible, totally hidden power of the storyteller.
It's a huge topic.
Massive, because we have this really pervasive modern habit of viewing storytelling as like a quaint luxury, right? Like a bedtime story we use to put a toddler to sleep
Or a blockbuster movie we watch to turn our brains off after a long week.
Right, exactly. But the stack of sources we have in front of us today, it just shatters that illusion completely. We're looking at storytelling as a literal survival tool, like the original foundational form of mass media.
To put it in the starkest terms possible, I mean, before our ancestors figured out how to write a single symbol, before they planted the first fields of wheat to invent agriculture.
Even before the first stone was laid for a city.
Right. Before any of that, the story was the primary infrastructure of human society. It was literally the operating system for human cooperation.
And we have an incredibly rich collection of research to unpack today to prove this. We're diving into field studies on modern hunter-gatherer populations. We've got historical analyses dissecting the massive political power of ancient Celtic bards and West African griots.
Oh, the griots are fascinating.
So fascinating. And then we're going to examine the really violent disruptive shockwaves caused by the printing press and the evolution of radio, and finally look at contemporary research on digital interactive narratives.
The whole timeline.
The whole timeline. The mission of this deep dive is to trace the sweeping, unbroken historical arc of the storyteller from, 200,000-year-old campfires all the way to the modern podcast you're listening to right this second.
And we're going to see how every major technological shift throughout human history has essentially threatened to completely eradicate the storyteller.
But they never do.
No, they just force the storyteller to shapeshift, to adapt, and actually emerge wielding even more power than before.
It's incredible. And I promise you, by the end of our time together, you will completely rethink the mechanics of what you are doing right now. You'll understand the deep, ancient evolutionary forces that physically compel you to listen to a voice in the dark.
It's baked into our neurobiology.
So let's unpack this, because if we want to understand why humans are so neurobiologically obsessed with stories today, we have to travel back to the evolutionary blueprint. So take us back to the beginning.
Okay, so rewinding the clock takes us to a window between roughly 200,000 and 40,000 BCE.
Okay.
Homo sapiens emerged roughly 200,000 years ago, and by that point, the physiological capacity for complex language was pretty much firmly in place. But narrative storytelling.
Like actual stories with a plot.
Right. The conscious, structured accounting of a sequence of events with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That didn't just spontaneously generate out of nowhere. The prevailing anthropological theory is that it originated in something much more utilitarian.
Which
A
was?
simple rhythmic chance.
Really? Like the work songs you see in historical depictions of manual labor, like a way to keep a group of people moving together.
That is the exact mechanism, yeah. Imagine early human bands engaging in just brutal, repetitive physical labor. Grinding tough seeds, knapping flint to sharpen tools.
Hauling heavy animal carcasses.
Exactly. Or walking vast distances across unforgiving terrain. To coordinate that labor, to synchronize their movements, and make that immense physical exertion psychologically bearable, they utilized rhythm.
Wow.
So the story essentially began as the steady beat of survival labor made communal.
That makes so much sense.
And over thousands of years, those practical chants expanded. They started to weave in explanations for the terrifying natural occurrences around them, like why does the sun disappear and return? What causes the lightning to strike the tree?
Right, because they didn't have science to explain it.
Exactly. So to answer these questions, they began assigning superhuman qualities to ordinary people or animals, which eventually gave birth to the very first hero myths.
Which fundamentally means that before anyone ever, carved a symbol into a clay tablet, before anyone fenced in a piece of land to farm it, nomadic hunter-gatherers were already crafting highly complex, artful narratives.
Absolutely. The creation of literature doesn't require a written alphabet. It doesn't require a sedentary agricultural society. Literature, in its deepest, most fundamental sense, was forged in the oral tradition of nomadic hunter-gatherers.
And the sheer durability of this spoken technology is just staggering when you look at the empirical data.
It really is.
And this is where I want to pause, actually, because the sources brought up something that completely broke my brain. When modern people think of oral history, we immediately associate it with that childhood game of telephone.
Oh, right, the whispering game.
Yeah. I whisper a phrase into your ear, you whisper it to the next person, and by the time it travels around a circle of 10 people, the phrase, the dog is brown, has hilariously mutated into the frog is drowning.
Right, it completely degrades.
And because of that game, we inherently assume oral storytelling is incredibly fragile. We think it's flawed and prone to rapid degradation.
Well, our modern bias assumes that without a hard drive or printed page, the data is just lost. But the research completely dismantles that assumption when you look at oral traditions operating under their natural historical conditions.
Tell us about the Australian tribe from the sources.
Yeah, so the sources highlight the indigenous Ngai tribe in Australia. They possess this oral story that meticulously details the creation of specific lakes, mountains, and coastal features in their exact territory.
Okay.
And geologists and climatologists actually applied modern dating techniques to the exact topographical formations that are described in these indigenous stories.
And the timeline they discovered was not just like a few generations old.
No, the geological data confirmed that the stories perfectly describe the topography of the region during the period when sea levels were violently rising after the last great ice age.
Wow.
And that specific geological process ended roughly 7,000 years ago.
I want to make sure we are properly emphasizing the weight of that number for the listener. We are talking about a continuous living narrative that is at least 10,000 years old.
At least. A 10,000-year-old account that is not some vague, mystical metaphor either.
Right.
It contains highly accurate, literal geographic data regarding coastal inundation and sea level rises. And it has been preserved with stunning fidelity across hundreds and hundreds of generations, relying entirely on the human voice and human memory.
But how is that mechanically possible? I mean, how does an oral society prevent the telephone game degradation over 10,000 years? How does a story survive hundreds of lifetimes without someone accidentally changing a crucial detail?
Well, the flaw in the telephone analogy is that it involves whispered, uncorrected secrets passed down a single fragile chain.
Right, one-to-one.
Exactly. Ancient oral traditions operated on entirely different mechanics. They were highly formalized, public performances. The storytellers utilized incredibly strict poetic meter, complex rhyming structures, and specific rhythmic breathing patterns.
Ah, so the format itself is a lock.
Yes, because if you change a single word in a rigidly structured poem, the rhythm breaks, right? And the error is immediately obvious to everyone listening. Furthermore, these stories were deeply tied to religious and cultural taboos.
Meaning you weren't allowed to mess with it?
Right. Altering the narrative was often viewed as a serious spiritual offense.
So it wasn't just one person remembering it alone in a vacuum. It was the entire community listening. If the storyteller got a single syllable wrong about how the mountain was formed, the elders sitting around the fire would just immediately correct them.
Exactly.
It functioned almost like a communal blockchain. Like every mind in the tribe had a ledger of the story, and the performance had to match the communal consensus.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The community cross-verifies the data in real time.
Wow.
But this incredibly complex preservation system brings up a massive evolutionary question, which leads us to a fascinating anthropological field study in our sources.
Let's get into it.
Well, think about it. Maintaining this communal blockchain requires an immense expenditure of time and cognitive energy. Memorizing a 10,000-year-old geographic map disguised as an epic poem it's neurobiologically expensive.
Right.
So in a harsh hunter-gatherer society where every single calorie matters, where starvation and predation are constant, daily risks, why do humans dedicate so much energy to it? I mean, doesn't sitting around a fire performing complex poems distract from the immediate life-or-death tasks of hunting animals and foraging for plants?
It seems like a glaring evolutionary paradox. Like,
Yeah.
if a behavior burns precious calories in time but doesn't put actual meat in your mouth or shield you from a tiger, the ruthless math of natural selection dictates that the behavior should be aggressively weeded out over time.
Exactly.
But the fact that storytelling is a ubiquitous, universal human trait across every culture on Earth means it must provide a massive, tangible evolutionary advantage.
It has to.
So to isolate exactly what that advantage is, evolutionary anthropologists actually embedded themselves with the Agta people.
Yeah, the ACTA provide the perfect living context to study this.
Let's paint a picture of the Agta for the listener. They are a contemporary hunter-gatherer population living deep in the northern Sierra Madre Natural Park in the Philippines.
That's a very remote area.
Incredibly remote. This is a rugged environment, accessible only by a small plane, a difficult boat journey, or literally a grueling 3-day hike through the jungle.
Right.
They live in small nomadic camps. Sometimes it's just a single extended family. Sometimes it scales up to around 150 people. They sustain themselves by hunting wild game, fishing in the rivers and ocean, and gathering wild roots and plants. And centrally, they are prolific, devoted storytellers.
Right, and the researchers wanted to decode the actual content of their oral tradition. So they painstakingly collected and analyzed 89 different stories across 7 diverse foraging societies, focusing heavily on the ACTA.
And what did they find?
The statistical breakdown was revealing. A staggering 70% of these stories centered explicitly on social behavior. These were not whimsical, escapist fantasies meant to distract people from a hard life. They were complex behavioral blueprints. They were mechanisms designed to coordinate social expectations and really broadcast the moral norms required to keep the camp functioning.
Let's dive into the actual plots of these ACTA stories, because seeing the mechanics of the narratives makes this so clear. Take the story they tell about the sun and the moon.
Oh, this is a great example. So the narrative sets up a conflict. The sun, who is personified as male, and the moon, who is personified as female, get into a bitter dispute over who has the right to illuminate the sky.
Right.
And the conflict escalates into a physical fight. But during the battle, the moon proves to be just as strong, resilient, and capable as the sun. Realizing they are equally matched and that fighting is just mutually destructive, they reach a cooperative compromise.
They split the shifts.
Exactly. They divide the duty. One takes the daylight, the other takes the night.
And when you peel back the astronomical metaphor there, it is a highly sophisticated story promoting sex equality.
Very sophisticated.
It actively teaches the community to value cooperation between the sexes by vividly illustrating the destructive costs of competition versus the systemic benefits of compromise.
And we see similar functional messaging in the story of the wild pig and the sea cow.
Oh, I love this one.
Yeah. So these two animals were best friends who absolutely loved to race each other. But tragedy strikes when the sea cow severely injures his legs and can no longer run.
Oh, no.
But instead of abandoning his broken friend, the wild pig carries the sea cow all the way to the ocean. In the water, the sea cow can swim incredibly fast, allowing them to race again, the pig sprinting on the shore, the sea cow gliding in the water.
It's an incredibly touching narrative, but its function is pure survival psychology. It teaches friendship, cooperation, and a concept researchers term advantageous inequality aversion.
Which is a fancy way of saying.
In plain terms, yeah, it instills the moral imperative that you do not abandon the vulnerable or injured members of your group, because today's injured sea cow might be tomorrow's fastest swimmer. But the story that completely fascinated me is The Monkey and the Giant.
Oh, the mechanics of this one are brilliant.
So good.
So the monkey and his smaller animal friends want to set up camp by a bountiful river. The problem is a terrifying, massive giant lives there and threatens to eat all of them.
Naturally.
Naturally. So the monkey, utilizing his superior intellect, tricks the giant into entering a dark cave that is secretly filled with aggressive bee and ant nests. The insects swarm the giant, ultimately killing him.
So the monkey wins.
The monkey is undeniably the hero. He saved the entire group. But right at the climax of the story, as his friends are congratulating him, they immediately remind him that even though he's the smartest animal in the whole forest, he's still physically small and vulnerable.
Right.
They warn him that the monkey-eating eagle could swoop down from the sky and take him at any moment.
That ending is structurally wild to me, because in a modern Hollywood movie, the story ends with a massive parade for the monkey, right? Giving him a medal and a little crown.
Roll credits, yeah.
Exactly. But the Agta specifically cap the hero's journey with a harsh reality check. It is a calculated mechanism to enforce egalitarianism. Anthropologists call it a reverse dominance hierarchy.
Right.
It's essentially a narrative weapon designed to teach the group that absolutely no individual, no matter how brilliant, heroic, or essential they just were, is ever allowed to elevate themselves above the group, become a tyrant, or get a big head.
They are literally preventing the rise of dictators through a campfire bedtime story.
That is so profound.
It's pure social engineering encoded into narrative form. The storytellers are continually calibrating the group's moral compass. But the researchers didn't just want to interpret the stories. They wanted hard data on how the presence of these storytellers physically altered the community's survival metrics.
So how do they test that?
To do this, they implemented a resource allocation game involving 290 AGTA adults.
This experiment is where the theoretical anthropology turns into hard, undeniable economic data, because the researchers used tokens that represented rice. Specifically, each token was worth 125 grams of rice, which is roughly equivalent to a full, sustaining meal for one individual.
A lot of food.
Yeah, in a remote foraging society where securing calories is a daily struggle, a bowl of rice is a highly valued liquid asset.
Definitely.
So they gave the participants a certain number of these tokens and presented them with a classic social dilemma. They said, you can either keep this rice entirely for yourself, or you can give some or all of it to your campmates. Do you hoard the calories to guarantee your own survival, or do you share them to help the group?
And alongside the game, the researchers asked the community members to identify who among them were the most skilled, recognized storytellers.
Okay, so they map out the storytellers.
Right. And when the researchers cross-referenced the geographic distribution of the storytellers with the results of the rice game, a massive, statistically significant correlation emerged.
What was it?
Camps that happened to have a higher proportion of recognized storytellers were fundamentally more cooperative. The individuals in those camps were far more willing to surrender their own rice tokens to feed others.
Wow.
The specific mathematical breakdown showed that a mere 1% increase in storyteller nominations within a camp correlated to an increase in resource donations by 2.2 percentage points.
That's huge.
The storytellers were functioning as the literal social glue. By constantly reciting stories about the sun, the moon, and the sea cow, they were generating an invisible atmosphere of trust, making people feel safe enough to share their vital food.
Okay, I hear that, but I am looking at the data on individual payoffs, and I have to push back on human logic here for a second.
Okay, sure.
Because the researchers asked the Agata an incredibly straightforward question. They asked, who would you most like to live with as a campmate? And the data shows that skilled storytellers were twice as likely to be chosen as preferred campmates.
Right.
They were valued higher than the community's best fishers and higher than the most lethal hunters.
They were.
So the data suggests that in a society where starvation is a literal, everyday threat, people would actively choose to live in a camp with a highly charismatic talker, rather than a guy who guarantees he can bring home a wild pig. How does that make any evolutionary sense?
It seems counterintuitive, I know. But it makes sense when you analyze the macro mechanics of group survival. Consider the reality of hunting. Even the absolute best hunter in the world is subject to luck, injury, and the unpredictable movements of game.
Right, he could sprain an ankle.
Exactly. A single star hunter might bring down a massive animal one week, but catch nothing for the next 3. If the camp relies solely on his individual skill, but lacks a culture of cooperation, meaning they hoard the meat, they fight over the prime cuts, they refuse to share with the sick.
Then the group fractures.
The group will eventually fracture and starve during the lean times. Conversely, a camp that cooperates flawlessly, where everyone forages, shares every scrap of food, and supports the injured, will capture far more total calories over a year and survive much longer than a fragmented camp with one arrogant star hunter.
And the storyteller is the engine of that flawless cooperation.
Exactly. They broadcast and reinforce the norms that make teamwork possible. The storyteller provides a massive, indispensable group-level benefit.
And because they provide that existential benefit to the group aggressively rewards the storyteller.
The math of natural selection proves it. As we noted, storytelling requires a massive investment of time and energy to practice, memorize, and perform. It is a costly behavior. If the storyteller wasn't getting a tangible return on that investment, the trait would have vanished from the gene pool.
But it didn't.
No, the data shows the exact opposite. Among the ACTA, skilled storytellers have, on average, 0.5 affair, 3 more living offspring than non-skilled storytellers.
Over half a child more on average.
Yes.
That is a staggering evolutionary advantage in a harsh environment. Simply because you're the person who can perfectly deliver the story of the monkey and the giant, your genetic lineage is significantly more likely to survive.
And the mechanism there is direct. Because the storyteller is universally preferred as a social partner, they receive vastly increased social support from the collective.
Like more rice tokens.
Literally. When researchers analyzed who received the most tokens during the rice game, skilled storytellers were disproportionately the recipients of resource transfers. The community literally feeds the storyteller, ensuring they are healthy and well-resourced, because the storyteller feeds the community's social cohesion.
It's a perfect, mutually beneficial biological trade.
It really is.
So to you, the listener, I want you to run a quick mental exercise. Think about your own life, your own family, your workplace, or your core group of friends. Who is the person who keeps everyone together?
There's always someone.
Always. Who is the one who organizes the holiday dinners, who remembers the complicated inside jokes, who smooths over the arguments, and who constantly recounts the stories of your shared past? That person isn't just being friendly. They are performing an ancient 200,000-year-old survival function.
They are the social glue.
They are your camp's designated storyteller, keeping everyone cooperative enough to survive the modern world.
It forces a profound paradigm shift, really. Storytelling is not some accidental byproduct of having a large human brain. It is arguably the primary driver of human cooperation. And if the narrative is this critical to survival, if it is the foundational infrastructure of society, it makes logical sense that as human populations expanded out of small nomadic bands and into massive, complex civilizations, they would not leave this vital function to chance.
Which transitions us perfectly into the next major epoch. As human groups scaled up, the act of storytelling underwent a massive structural transformation.
It had to.
Right. Sometime roughly around 1300 BCE, as complex societies began to solidify, storytelling stopped being a general, egalitarian activity that anyone could do around the campfire. It calcified into a highly specialized, fiercely guarded professional role. We enter the era of the professional keepers of truth and memory.
And this transition marks the moment when the storyteller becomes arguably the most powerful political figure in any given civilization.
Because they control the narrative.
Because they completely control the narrative infrastructure. They hold the monopoly on memory. They alone possess the authority to decide which ancestors are venerated as gods, which neighboring tribes are vilified as eternal enemies, and what the community fundamentally believes is objectively true about its own identity.
Let's trace how this massive power manifested across different global cultures, starting with the incredible traditions of West Africa. Our sources dive deep into the role of the griot, a tradition that formally originated in the 13th century within the sprawling Mande Empire of Mali.
The griot is one of the most fascinating cultural figures in history. To call them just a storyteller is a massive understatement.
It really is.
They function as historians, genealogists, praise singers, poets, musicians, and high-level political diplomats, all synthesized into a single role. And crucially, this was not a hobby or career you could simply choose to pursue. The griots formed an endogamous caste.
Meaning they were a closed society. They strictly married only other griots, keeping the bloodline and the knowledge entirely within specific families.
The generational transmission was absolute. Every powerful aristocratic family, every lineage of warrior kings or emperors was permanently bonded to an accompanying family of griots. There's actually a famous West African proverb, no griot can be without a king, and no king can be without a griot.
Wow.
The king may have commanded the armies and held the physical monopoly on violence, but the griot held the historical power. The king's legacy was entirely at the mercy of the griot song.
And the physical and mental training required to inherit this power sounds borderline superhuman. The sources detail how a griot child begins years and years of rigorous daily memorization almost as soon as they can speak.
It's an entire childhood of training.
Yeah, and in many lineages, a child is taught not just to play, but to physically construct their own complex instruments from scratch by the time they are 7 or 8 years old. They learn to build the kora, which is a massive 21-string harp lute made from a large calabash gourd, or the balafon, which is a complex wooden xylophone.
Right.
And only after decades of brutal study, after perfectly acquiring a repertoire of hundreds of multi-hour epic songs and genealogical trees, do they finally earn the right to perform publicly.
Anthropologists and historians often compare the griot to an ancient baobab tree or a living library. When a griot dies, the saying goes, it is as if a massive library has burned to the ground.
Because they were the only record.
Exactly. They were the living, breathing testimony to a society's entire existence. And because they were the sole repository of that history, they possessed the terrifying power to destroy reputations or to elevate kings to the status of gods. If a ruler angered their griot, their great deeds were simply erased from the record. It's gone. Or worse, they were permanently immortalized in a mocking, satirical song that would outlive their empire.
And we see that exact same weaponization of poetry and memory in the ancient Celtic and Irish traditions.
Very similar, yeah.
You had the Sean-Shai, who were the traveling keepers of local lore and myth. But at the higher political levels, you had the bards. And a high-ranking bard possessed an incredibly sharp, dangerous political power. If a chieftain was greedy or unjust, a bard could compose a specific type of satirical verse so culturally devastating, so deeply humiliating to the leader's honor, that it could literally force the chieftain to abdicate his rule.
Imagine the gravity of the spoken word in a society where oral memory is the only permanent record.
It's huge.
A poem so precise and socially damaging that it legally unseats a ruler. It is a level of artistic consequence we really cannot fathom today.
We see similar dynamics with the Anglo-Saxon Scots, too. While the sources note that modern scholars debate their exact day-to-day historical reality, their cultural function in the literature was essentially acting as the public relations arm for medieval warlords and rulers. They were tasked with immortalizing the king's heroic deeds in verse to legitimize his rule.
Right.
And then, shifting to the Middle East, we have the rich tradition of the Hakawati.
The Hakawati. The term actually stems directly from the Arabic words for story and speak.
Okay.
And during their absolute golden age in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Hakawatis were the undisputed masters of communal entertainment and cultural transmission. They held court in bustling coffeehouses across the Levant, captivating massive crowds with sweeping epic tales like the 1001 Nights or the heroic legends of King Baybars.
The sheer physical stamina required by a Hakawati is unbelievable to me. The source material highlights one legendary performer, Ahmad al-Sadawi. He spent 372 consecutive nights recounting just one single epic tale of King Baybars to an audience in a Lebanese coffeehouse.
Nearly a year.
Just conceptualize that, more than an entire year of nightly, multi-hour performances, holding a room full of adults completely spellbound with a single, massive, continuously unfolding narrative.
It speaks volumes about the deep biological hunger humans possess for sustained narrative connection. These professional storytellers were not just passing time, They were bridging generations, constantly reinforcing moral frameworks and actively shaping public opinion on contemporary issues through the lens of ancient myth.
The sources also feature a really interesting note about how modern authors interpret and internalize this historical power. A blogger and fantasy author named Marian L. Thorpe discusses her approach to fictional world-building. In her novels, she created an elite order of storytellers called the Scallion. And she explicitly modeled them after the historical Irish Seilai and the Scandinavian Skalds. The historical Skalds, by the way, are fascinating because they didn't just sing praises, they were tasked with memorizing and reciting the complex legal codes of the society.
It's a huge responsibility.
And their name is actually etymologically linked to the modern English word scold because they were culturally authorized to publicly rebuke and jeer at people who broke the law.
That etymological connection is vital, because the ancient storyteller was never just a sycophant singing pretty songs for the king. They were the objective conscience of the community. They were the only ones authorized to scold the powerful without facing execution.
In Thorpe's fictionalized version, these Scallion are so culturally revered that they are required to travel completely unarmed, because injuring or killing one is the ultimate societal taboo. And they are bound by a mystical code to tell the absolute, objective truth of what happened, unless a specific authority legally forbids them to speak. Now, obviously, that is a fantasy novel extrapolation, but it perfectly mirrors the historical reality of the Skalds and Griots we're discussing.
The fiction brilliantly distills the profound truth of the archetype. The storyteller's physical body had to be protected by severe taboos, and their word had to be trusted implicitly, because they were the solitary mechanism for storing a civilization's truth.
Okay, I want to synthesize all of this because I think a modern analogy helps grasp the sheer magnitude of this societal role. If I am interpreting all this anthropological and historical data correctly, these individuals, the griot, the high bard, the skald, they functioned as Wikipedia, the Supreme Court, and the nightly news broadcast, all rolled into one single human mind.
That is perhaps the most accurate way to conceptualize the weight of their societal function.
But the implications of that are terrifying. That gives a very small group of people an absolute monopoly on reality. If the griot decided a historical battle happened a certain way, or if the skald interpreted a law a certain way, that simply became reality. There was no competing database you could check.
You've hit on the core vulnerability of the era. They held a total, uncompromising monopoly on memory. They stood as the gatekeepers at the border between the living and the dead, controlling exactly what information flowed across time. It was a position of supreme, almost godlike authority. But as human history repeatedly demonstrates, whenever an institution holds a centralized, absolute monopoly, it becomes a massive target. If you want to democratize human thought, you have to find a way to separate the story from the physical body of the storyteller.
Which brings us to the first massive existential rupture in the timeline. Because how do you strip a powerful, deeply entrenched institution of its monopoly? You invent a piece of technology that does their exact job, but better, cheaper, and without needing their physical presence. We are talking about the technological meteors that threaten to render the oral storyteller extinct, the invention of writing, and eventually the printing press.
The initial invention of writing, which occurred in Mesopotamia roughly around 3000 BCE, was the first crack in the storyteller's armor.
Great.
Now, you'd assume that the moment humanity figured out how to write a story down, the oral tradition would instantly die. But the disruption was incredibly slow.
Why?
Because for thousands of years after cuneiform and hieroglyphs were invented, the vast, overwhelming majority of the global population remained completely illiterate.
If you can't read the language, the clay tablet or the papyrus scroll is just a useless object to you. You still absolutely rely on the storyteller to translate the universe for you.
Precisely. Right up until the Middle Ages in Europe, writing was a highly guarded technology reserved for a tiny, powerful elite, usually monks in scriptoriums, high priests, and the aristocratic upper classes. Because the general public could not read, literature and text were still written with the explicit functional intention of being performed aloud.
So the book was basically a script.
The words on the page were essentially just sheet music. The literature was designed to be heard in a communal setting. Therefore, the storyteller's physical body, the modulation of their voice, their theatrical gestures, their presence in the room, it all remained absolutely central to the experience of a narrative.
But then comes the ultimate world-shattering disruptor. In roughly 1453, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg finishes perfecting the movable type printing press.
Gutenberg's press is the definitive turning point in Western culture and world history. Before his machine, if you wanted a copy of a book, a monk had to sit in a drafty scriptorium and painstakingly hand copy every single letter with a quill.
It took months to make one book.
Exactly. And because the Catholic Church and the feudal monarchies completely controlled these scriptoriums, they acted as society's absolute agenda setters. They decided what ideas were acceptable to reproduce and what ideas were heretical and relegated to the dustbin of history. They maintained a total stranglehold on the transmission of complex thought.
The printing press was like taking the water out of a single, highly guarded well and suddenly making it rain everywhere.
Yes.
You didn't need the guards anymore. The press bypassed the church's censorship apparatus completely. It slashed the economic cost of producing a book to a fraction of what it was, making literature accessible to a rapidly expanding middle class. It spurred a massive continent-wide wave of literacy.
Suddenly, radical ideas that challenged the absolute power of religion and the monarchy could be mass-produced and spread across Europe faster than the authorities could burn them.
And while the political implications are massive, the psychological implications for the storyteller were devastating. As widespread literacy rates skyrocketed, a profound shift occurred in human neurology.
Yeah.
For the first time in history, reading stopped being a communal oral experience where a group listened to someone read aloud. It transformed into a silent, deeply solitary act undertaken inside the reader's own mind, often purely for personal pleasure.
The communal fire of the tribe was replaced by the solitary candle of the individual reader.
A beautiful and accurate summary. The story was finally liberated from the human body. It could travel across oceans and centuries without a human carrier. You no longer needed the griot or the bard to be physically present, breathing in the room with you to receive their knowledge. The profound dependency on the physical storyteller was broken.
The narrative became a private, internal dialogue between the reader and the page.
So the professional, living oral storyteller is suddenly staring down the barrel of extinction. As the printing press dominates, and later as the Industrial Revolution starts pulling people out of their ancestral rural villages and cramming them into massive urban factory towns, the old, tight-knit oral communities begin to disintegrate.
They fall apart, yeah.
And this impending loss triggers what historians call the 19th century folklore revival. Suddenly, you have these educated urban academics and folklore collectors swooping into the countryside to save the dying stories. We're talking about famous figures like the Brothers Grimm in Germany, Hans Christian Andersen in Denmark, and Peter Christian Asbjørnsen and Jürgen Moe in Norway.
These scholars recognized that the ancient oral tradition was rapidly vanishing under the wheels of industry, and they launched a massive effort to rescue it. But it's vital to understand that they were not storytellers in the ancient fluid sense. They were archivists and curators.
Right.
They took a living, breathing, constantly evolving oral tradition, and they pinned it down like a butterfly on a board. They froze it in amber. By committing the fluid oral tales to the permanent printed page, they fundamentally altered their nature.
I really want to challenge the romanticism that surrounds this era, though, because when modern people think of the Brothers Grimm, we envision kindly, grandfatherly scholars rescuing magical fairy tales for children to enjoy.
Like Uncle Grimm reading a nice story.
Exactly, but based on our sources, it sounds much more like they were the original corporate rebranders. They took something that was raw, dangerous, and functional, and heavily edited it to make it palatable and commercially viable for the new, highly moralistic Victorian middle-class reading public.
You're hitting on a crucial, often overlooked reality, that our research explicitly highlights the brutal sanitization of the story. The original oral tradition, the ancient stories passed down by hunter-gatherers, the terrifying tales of the deep woods, is what folklorists refer to as the dark tradition.
Because life was dark. These stories weren't about sparkling princesses, singing mice, and guaranteed happily ever afters.
Not at all. The ancient stories were about genuine terror, harsh moral warnings, and raw physical survival. They dealt frankly with starvation, sexual violence, incest, cannibalism, and the brutal, unforgiving realities of the natural world. Yeah, let's look at the mechanics of a story like Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella. In the original ancient oral versions, the young female protagonists often had to save themselves through ruthless cunning, or they faced horrific ends as a stark warning to children about the literal dangers of trusting strangers in a forest where actual wolves and human predators lived.
Right, it was a survival manual.
Exactly. But the Grimm brothers and their contemporaries took those dark, functional survival tales and aggressively edited them. They stripped out the agency, inserted strict Victorian gender roles, and added magical, miraculous rescues like the brave male woodsman cutting the wolf open.
That wasn't in the original.
Nope. The sanitized, safe-for-children fairy tale, delivered by the archetype of a quaint, harmless village elder, is a completely modern, manufactured invention of the print era.
By systematically making the stories safe, polite, and moralistic, they completely erased the living, dangerous, political, and survival utility of the original stories. They effectively neutered the storyteller.
They downgraded a vital piece of survival technology into mere nursery entertainment. And for a brief, distinct moment in modern history, as books and newspapers dominated the globe, it truly seemed like the silent, printed text had permanently killed the oral storyteller.
But history loves a dramatic plot twist. Just when the physical, spoken storyteller seemed completely obsolete, relegated to the dusty shelves of children's libraries, a completely new technology materialized out of the ether. It brought the disembodied human voice back into the center of the home. I'm talking, of course, about the magic of radio.
The evolution of radio is one of the most fascinating scientific and cultural sagas of the modern age.
It's wild.
It wasn't a sudden invention by a lone genius. It was a decades-long, iterative buildup of theoretical physics and engineering. It begins in 1864 when the brilliant physicist James Clerk Maxwell published complex mathematical theories proving that invisible electromagnetic waves could travel through space at the speed of light.
Just theory at that point.
Pure theory. But decades later, in 1886, a German physicist named Heinrich Hertz built a spark gap transmitter and physically proved that Maxwell's invisible waves actually existed.
He proved the math.
Building on that, by 1897, the Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi had aggressively commercialized the technology, dominating ship-to-shore communication.
But Marconi's system was entirely reliant on Morse code. It was just an endless stream of static dots and dashes. It transferred data, sure, but it lacked the human soul. It wasn't a voice.
Right.
The true paradigm shift, the resurrection of the storyteller, happened on Christmas Eve, 1906. A Canadian physicist named Reginald Fessenden had been experimenting with continuous wave transmission.
This is a great story.
That night, sailors out on the freezing, dark Atlantic Ocean, wearing their heavy headsets and expecting to hear the sterile, rhythmic beeps of Morse code, were suddenly shocked to hear a human voice speaking into their ears. Fessenden read a passage from the Bible and played "O Holy Night" on his violin. To those isolated sailors floating in the dark, hearing a disembodied voice materialize out of the static must have felt like absolute magic.
That crackly Christmas Eve transmission was the seed of modern broadcasting. But radio transitioned from a quirky scientific curiosity into a world-dominating mass medium incredibly abruptly. The watershed cultural moment occurred on November 2nd, 1920.
That was the legendary KDKA broadcast in Pittsburgh.
Exactly.
They fired up their transmitter and broadcast the live, incoming returns of the Harding-Cox presidential election. It is widely considered the very first commercial radio broadcast, and the public adoption rate of this technology was simply astronomical. By 1930, just 10 short years after that election night, an astonishing 60% of all households in the United States owned a radio receiver.
Consider the massive societal impact of that rapid adoption. At that time, roughly half of the American population lived in isolated rural communities. Radio was utterly transformative for them. It collapsed the vast geographic gap between the rural farmhouse and the bustling urban center.
Suddenly, you weren't isolated.
Exactly. Breaking news, sports, and entertainment no longer took days to travel via slow-moving trains delivering newspapers. It arrived in the living room instantaneously, in real time. For the first time, an entire massive nation was participating in the exact same simultaneous cultural conversation.
It ushered in the legendary golden age of radio. The deep psychological intimacy of the human voice returned to the center of the home, replacing the silent reading of the printed page. And we saw the ancient tribal power of the storyteller wielded on an unprecedented, massive scale.
Oh, absolutely.
You had President Franklin D. Roosevelt utilizing his famous fireside chats. He bypassed the critical newspaper editors entirely and spoke directly, warmly, into the homes of terrified citizens, molding public sentiment and offering vital psychological comfort during the depths of the Great Depression.
And you had legendary journalists like Edward R. Murrow broadcasting live from the rooftops of London, with the terrifying sound of air raid sirens wailing in the background during the Blitz, bringing the stark, visceral reality of a European war directly into the safety of American living rooms.
And perhaps the most potent, undeniable example of the radio storyteller's raw power occurred on October 30th, 1938, with Orson Welles' infamous broadcast of The War of the Worlds.
Oh man, this is the ultimate proof of the concept.
Welles takes a fictional sci-fi story about a violent Martian invasion, and he brilliantly formats the performance to mimic a series of urgent, live news bulletins breaking into regular music programming.
He weaponized the format.
And it literally panics a significant portion of the nation. People believe the aliens were actually landing in New Jersey. It proves that a single authoritative voice in the dark still held enough ancient neurobiological power over the human mind to make people pack their cars and flee their homes in genuine terror.
The human brain is evolutionarily hardwired to trust the urgency of the spoken word over the written word. But the technology of radio was not a static monolith. It had its own fierce internal evolution and brutal corporate warfare.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Well, for the majority of the Golden Age, all broadcasting was conducted on the AM band amplitude modulation.
Let's explain the mechanics of AM radio waves travel incredibly far, especially at night when they literally bounce off the Earth's ionosphere, allowing a station in Chicago to be heard in Texas. But the signal itself is super vulnerable to electrical interference.
Very vulnerable.
A thunderstorm rolling in, or even just turning on a vacuum cleaner in your house, introduces massive amounts of static that ruins the audio quality.
Recognizing this massive flaw, a brilliant engineer named Edwin Armstrong invented FM frequency modulation in 1933. Instead of varying the height or amplitude of the radio wave, his system varied the frequency.
Making it static-free.
FM was immune to static. It offered crystal clear, high-fidelity sound that could perfectly replicate the nuances of a symphony or a human voice. It was technologically superior to AM in every conceivable way.
I was looking at the notes on this era, and I was wondering if FM was so clearly superior, why didn't the entire industry immediately switch over? And it looks like it was pure, ruthless corporate sabotage.
It was. David Sarnoff, the immensely powerful head of RCA, was originally friends with Armstrong. But Sarnoff saw FM as a massive threat because he was secretly pouring all of RCA's capital into developing television.
He didn't want a distraction.
He didn't want a new competing audio format disrupting his massive AM radio profits while he built TV. So he actively withheld corporate backing for FM. And then it gets worse. After World War II, the FCC, the government regulatory body, suddenly announced a change in the assigned frequency band for FM. They moved it from the original 42 to 50 megahertz band up to the 88 to 108 megahertz band we use today.
Wow. And what did that do?
That single regulatory decision instantly rendered nearly 500,000 existing expensive FM radio receivers completely obsolete. You bought a cutting-edge FM radio, and the government essentially bricked it overnight.
While millions of cheap AM radios were still being manufactured and sold without interruption, it completely crippled the adoption of FM. It wasn't until 1978 that FM listenership finally surpassed AM. And it wasn't driven by news or storytelling. It was driven by music fans in the late 60s and 70s demanding the higher audio quality of FM to listen to complex, album-oriented rock music in stereo.
And while commercial radio chased mass audiences, sold advertising, and fought brutal corporate wars over bandwidth, there was a completely different, quieter model of storytelling surviving in the background: community radio.
Yes, starting primarily with Pacifica's KPFA, which launched in Berkeley, California in 1949. This was America's very first listener-supported station. The mechanics of the community radio model are fundamentally opposed to the commercial model.
Entirely different.
It is fiercely nonprofit, incredibly locally focused, and operated largely by passionate volunteers rather than highly paid professionals.
Our sources indicate that community radio remains incredibly vital globally today. They operate on shoestring budgets, sometimes under $100,000 a year, relying on the dedication of hundreds of volunteers.
And what do they broadcast?
They do the crucial, unglamorous storytelling work that massive commercial stations ignore because it isn't profitable. They preserve dying indigenous languages, they broadcast highly localized arts and culture, and they provide critical, hyperlocal emergency alerts during disasters.
It functions as the closest modern equivalent to the ancient tribal campfire. It is a specific community speaking directly to itself, serving its own highly localized, unique needs. Now, looking at the broader media landscape, I have to ask a blunt question.
Go for it.
In the 1950s, everyone confidently predicted that television would completely kill radio. Then, in the 2000s, everyone predicted the internet, iPods, and smartphones would be the final nail in the coffin.
Right.
But our sources highlight a truly shocking statistic. While traditional pay TV penetration is plummeting rapidly, down roughly 20 percentage points over a recent decade as people cut the cord. Overall, radio listenership has remained incredibly stubbornly stable. Why? Why hasn't the radio died?
Because radio survives by perfectly filling the specific cognitive and physical spaces that glowing screens cannot safely occupy.
Yeah.
You cannot safely watch a television show or scroll a social media feed while driving your car down a highway at 70 miles an hour. You often don't want to stare at a harsh screen while chopping vegetables in the kitchen. And in a severe crisis, a hurricane, a massive snowstorm, or an earthquake when the power grid fails and the internet infrastructure collapses, a simple battery-powered radio is literally your only lifeline to the outside world.
But it goes deeper than just practical utility, doesn't it? It's about the psychology of the medium.
Absolutely. The audience data consistently shows that listeners tune in for the emotional, human connection. They actively crave the unscripted, real-time presence of a local personality.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A massive tech company's algorithm can easily generate a mathematically perfect, endless playlist of songs you will probably enjoy. But an algorithm cannot replicate the warmth, the spontaneous humor, and the shared geographic reality of a living human voice talking about the weather in your specific town.
Which brings us perfectly to the present day. And the final massive shift in our deep dive, the digital age and the postmodern rebirth. If radio brought the disembodied voice back into the home, what happens to the narrative when digital technology allows the listener to talk back and manipulate the story?
We see a fundamental structural shift in how narratives are built and consumed. The advent of digital technologies, the internet, and hypertext profoundly challenged the traditional, strictly linear storytelling model we inherited from the printing press era.
We have officially entered the realm of postmodern literature and interactive digital narratives.
We're talking about hypertext fiction, vast digital novels, video games with branching narratives, and choose-your-own-adventure style online experiences. The reader is no longer just passively sitting back and receiving a locked, unchanging text from an author.
The agency of the consumer becomes the central feature. By making continuous choices that actively alter the direction, pacing, and ultimate outcome of the story, the reader is actively subverting the conventional godlike notion of authorship.
Let's explain the postmodern aspect of this. Postmodernism, at its core, rejects the idea of a single, objective, universally agreed-upon reality.
Okay.
When a digital story has multiple different endings depending on where you click, it perfectly physically manifests those postmodern themes. Reality is fragmented, truth is a multiplicity of options, and the narrative is entirely subjective to the individual user's choices.
So how does this explosion of digital fragmentation connect back to the ancient storyteller? Because the historical arc actually circles back on itself here in a truly fascinating way.
It does. Think back to the era of the tribal campfire or the ancient bards. Oral storytelling was inherently deeply flexible. The storyteller didn't just stand up and blindly recite a rigid, unchanging script from memory regardless of the room.
Right, they read the room.
They dynamically adapted the story on the fly based on the real-time reactions of the audience sitting right in front of them. If the audience started looking bored, the storyteller instantly added a thrilling battle scene. If the children looked too scared, they wove in a joke to break the tension.
The story was a living organism, co-created in real time by the teller and the listener. And ironically, highly complex digital interactive storytelling, despite relying on advanced silicon and code, is actually a functional return to this ancient, fluid flexibility.
Exactly. The static, frozen-in-amber text of the printing press era was the historical anomaly. Interactivity is a return to our narrative roots.
And structurally speaking, there is one specific modern medium that perfectly captures and scales that ancient dynamic, the podcast.
The podcast is undeniably the closest modern equivalent to the ancient oral storyteller.
Let's analyze the architecture of the experience you and the listener are having right now.
Right.
It is an intimate single voice speaking directly into the ear of a listener. And that listener, as we noted at the beginning, is usually completely alone, perhaps in the dark, walking, driving, or lying in bed. It perfectly replicates the psychological intimacy of the ancient campfire, but it uses server farms to scale that intimacy globally.
And we are seeing these ancient, localized traditions being actively revived through these exact digital tools. The sources mention that the Hakawati tradition is experiencing a massive resurgence in the Middle East right now. Young storytellers are using social media platforms and podcast feeds to reach massive new audiences, bypassing traditional television networks entirely.
We culturally celebrate this massive democratization of media. Anyone with a cheap microphone and a Wi-Fi connection can launch a podcast and declare themselves a storyteller.
But we have to rigorously acknowledge the dark, destabilizing flip side of this total democratization. We established clearly in our deep dive that the ancient storyteller's immense power, the political power of the griot or the survival utility of the Aksa elder, was derived entirely from scarcity and sanctioned memory.
They were the single, designated, universally trusted keeper of the one agreed-upon communal truth.
Right, so when the barrier to entry drops to zero, when absolutely everyone has a microphone and an audience, the central, unifying authority of the storyteller completely vanishes.
The fragmentation becomes absolute. When everyone is a storyteller broadcasting their own version of reality, the foundational question of whose story is objectively true becomes permanently unresolvably open.
The central authority that holds a society's worldview together shatters into millions of pieces.
It is like we took the single warm village campfire where the entire tribe gathered shoulder to shoulder to hear one unifying protective story, and we violently shattered it into 8 billion isolated glowing smartphone screens. We all have a voice now, which is a beautiful triumph of technology, but are we even listening to the same story anymore?
That is the ultimate defining paradox of our modern digital age. We have successfully engineered the most perfect, frictionless tools for transmitting narrative in the history of human civilization. But in the process of building perfect transmission, we have almost completely lost the communal consensus that the ancient griot effortlessly commanded. The Agja storyteller utilized their narratives to keep the camp from fragmenting, to ensure everyone operated on the same moral facts so they could cooperate to survive a harsh world.
And today?
Today, we possess godlike technology, but we lack the shared unifying narrative.
Let's pull all of these monumental shifts together. We have journeyed through an immense, complex historical arc today. We started in the deep past with the Agta hunter-gatherers, proving definitively that stories were never just idle entertainment. They were a vital neurobiological social technology used to encode survival data and ensure group cooperation.
We moved into the era of complex empires, exploring the highly trained griots and hakawadis, professional keepers of memory who literally held the historical power of kings in their hands.
We saw how the technological meteor of the printing press shattered their ancient monopoly, silencing the spoken word and leading to the rampant sanitization of the dark, functional survival traditions.
Then we witnessed radio miraculously resurrect the disembodied voice, pulling it from the ether and placing it back into the center of our homes during times of crisis.
And finally, we arrived at the highly interactive, deeply fragmented, postmodern digital age of the podcast.
It stands as a remarkable testament to the absolute durability of the human biological need for narrative. The physical medium constantly evolves from a rhythmic chant to a vibrating string to a printed page to a radio wave to a digital stream, but the core primal function of the story remains constant.
So to you, the listener, sitting there right now with my voice resonating in your ears, I want you to deeply realize that by simply putting on your headphones and engaging with this deep dive, you are not just consuming content. You are actively participating in a 200,000-year-old, unbroken human ritual of knowledge sharing. You have pulled up a seat at the global digital campfire.
And as the fire dies down, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you take off your headphones and return to the silence of your own world. We've established that the fundamental evolutionary purpose of the original storyteller was to unify the group. It was to establish a baseline of shared facts and shared moral norms so the tribe could cooperate efficiently and survive the terrors of a hostile world.
But what happens to human cooperation when algorithms are designed to perfectly customize a completely different, highly interactive, utterly unique reality for every single person? If you and your neighbor no longer share the same stories, if you no longer believe in the same foundational narratives about what is true and what is false, can we still cooperate? Can we still survive the same giant?
It is, without exaggeration, the most pressing existential question of our era.
Thank you so much for exploring this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the media you consume, keep analyzing the narratives you are fed, and keep seeking out the stories that truly matter. Because, as we said at the start, you might look at your phone and think you're just holding a piece of modern technology. But the real technology, the invisible machinery that will ultimately determine if our society holds together or shatters apart, is the story itself.